All right, everyone, we're gonna get started here. Thank you guys so much for joining us tonight for the first episode in our series. Let me just introduce us, both who your presenter is, myself, and then who we are as a company. So my name's Toby, and tonight our speaker is going to be Elizabeth. I'm just gonna be your host before she drops some knowledge on us. And then let me just talk a little bit about who Altered States Integration is. So we, Altered States Integration, are an online peer coaching platform that provides personalized, accessible, and affordable psychedelic aftercare and harm reduction. Our website has webinars, we have some blogs, and we're hoping to expand maybe into a forum in the future. We also do harm reduction, just education in general, and then we're expanding into harm reduction spaces at festivals, concerts, and different art events. So look for us at some festivals near you in the future. I just got a couple disclaimers. I want to go over a couple ground rules and then we'll get started. Please keep your devices muted. If you have any questions, hold them towards the end. We'll have a section for questions if you have anything come up. And then I just got a disclaimer. Altered States Integration owners and operators are not licensed therapists, and we do not claim to diagnose, treat, or cure diseases. Peer coaches do not assess individuals for mental health conditions, nor provide psychotherapy, counseling, or any other mental health service that may require board licensure. Altered States Integration does not encourage or condone the purchase, sale, or transfer of any illegal substances, nor do they encourage or condone partaking in any unlawful activities related to illegal substances. Any correspondence violating these terms to or on Altered States Integration website will be ignored, deleted, and blocked.
Thank you, Toby. Hi, this is Elizabeth, and today we're going to talk about Psychedelic Healing 101, a beginner's guide. Today's part 1 focuses on a brief history of psychedelics. We're going to look at ancient psychedelic plants, how early humans used them. We're going to travel through time and history, past the witches and the shamans, and look at modern psychedelic revolution. We're going to talk about some of the major things that happened during the first, second, and third wave of psychedelics. And then we're going to look at the future of psychedelics and where they're going now. Early humans had a variety of experiences with plants and animals that they interacted with. Many of their discoveries happened by accident. They were foragers. They would come across a foodstuff that they recognized or didn't recognize, and they would oftentimes try it out. So if they were having a lot of famine, they might find food that was spoiled, but they would eat it anyway. This is how alcohol was discovered, and many other foodstuffs were fermentation type foodstuffs, using mold to make our food turn into penicillin later on was even a discovery by accident. So things like mushrooms would have come into the early humans. Homo sapiens would have eaten them and then had an experience that didn't kill them and may have gone back for more because they needed to eat something or because they found that the experience was palatable. Terence McKenna actually suggests that eating these mushrooms and psychedelic plants actually increased the Homo sapiens' ability to think. And so it helped them grow new neurons. It gave them ideas they'd never had before, inspiration, even art throughout history would have come from these psychoactive plants and even non-psychoactive plants that are alternatives that we think of today as being drugs and medicine. So probably very important in human development. And then as we progress through time, we built a culture around these psychedelic plants. We have witches and shamans, mystics, alchemists, curanderas, medicine men. These were all wise people from the community that had access to knowledge through the plant world. And many of our herbs that we use today for medicine are to have spoken to the shaman or to the medicine man and told them what they should be using. And psychedelics were likely involved in this process of having this higher collective wisdom. And when we look back through history, these people were the ones who were the keepers of all this knowledge, and they passed it down from generation to generation. And this is what the beginning of our medicine as a whole is for even Western medicine. So things like aspirin came from a plant, things like malaria drugs like quinine came from plants. At this point, we're moving beyond that in medicine, but up until the last 50 years in history, everything was plant medicine. Plant medicine is the history of medicine. And so these wise people were the keepers of that information, and they helped us move forward with technology and spirituality and culture through these psychedelic plants that they would either consume themselves and act as a conduit for the people that they were around, for their patients, or they would, split them with the community, and the community would actually partake, and it would be part of a ritual. Maybe it would be a coming of age. Maybe it would be when somebody died or got married. There's a lot of different ceremony and ritual and rite of passage that was involved, and that might be involved in taking it or having the shaman take it for you and being the conduit to the divine. And we know that psychedelic plants and intoxicants were used for a millennia. As early as 60,000 BCE, the pruiti was chewed by the Australian Aborigines, and we have evidence of that. So that's thousands and thousands of years before we really had a lot of the technologies that we have. So psychedelic plants were really one of the first technologies that humans had, and scientific technology, a way of discovering the world that was like a microscope or a lens. And then later on, we see evidence of cannabis in about 8,000 BC. We have opium coming on the scene, domesticated. Now, when we say that, that means that that's when we know that they were actually going through and farming opium. That doesn't mean that we didn't know what opium was. We had to have known about what opium was as a plant, as using poppies as a medicine for stomach aches or for fevers or for toothaches that the early ancestors would have had. They would have been collecting them, and eventually they decided that they would cultivate them. As you see in this picture, we have this wonderful painting from around 5000 BCE of a shaman holding mushrooms, and that's from southeastern Algeria. And then we have peyote on the hieroglyphs in Lower Pecos, Texas. And so you can see it's all over the globe. And these are just the discoveries that we've seen. Many things from early man are gone, and so we don't hold that technology except for through the oral tradition. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So that brings us up really to the modern age of psychedelics. Modern history is like I said, the history of plants is the history of medicine. So as medicine is starting to become its own technology, and we're starting to learn more about pills and science and microscopes and germ theory, we also have mescaline being investigated as a research project in the late 1890s. Now, in 1919, they did synthesize the first mescaline. So that's probably the first synthesized psychedelic that we know of. And that enters us into the age of medical revolution. This is the time frame where we figured out how to refine a lot of drugs into things like opium, where cocaine was being put in Coca-Cola, and then eventually it was taken out of Coca-Cola. A lot of herbs were being extracted. Aspirin was being invented. In between World War I and World War II, we started knowing how to use quinine for malaria. So this is happening all at the same time as we're first looking at psychedelics. So the lens of science is now focused on plants and how we can refine them more and more. And not a lot was done with psychedelics because we didn't find a very good use for them at the time, and we were very busy kind of solving other types of problems like chickenpox and malaria. And that brings us all the way up until after World War II, when we enter the modern revolution of psychedelics. Now, that's heralded by two very important things happening. The first is an accidental discovery by Albert Hofmann in 1943. Now, he had been looking at lysergic acid dimethylamide about 5 years before, and they thought it was going to be a stimulant. But what they found out was that it didn't give them the circulatory stimulation that they thought it was going to. And they didn't use like people's studies. So all the studies were in animals, and they just recorded what the animals were, and they noticed that the animals were agitated. And so Albert Hofmann put that research aside, and he had pulled it out of the closet and was starting to think about what they might use this substance for when he had an accident and got some of it on his fingers. Now, this is not a so uncommon discovery in early science. There's been a few others. Aspartame is another one that was an accident where a scientist wasn't being as clean as they could, and they actually got the substance on them. And that's how we discovered what it was. So Albert Hofmann had a couple hours of some dysphoria, and he had some, strange visions of like colors and brightness, and he was very curious about this. And so about 5 days later, he decided to go ahead and take a dose of 250 micrograms of LSD. And this is the first ever trip on LSD. So they call that day the bicycle day, because that's the day that he rode home from his lab on his bicycle on a very large dose of LSD. So that was a really important discovery. And after he had this experience, he shared it with a lot of other people, and it kind of started the ball rolling. Now, in very close history, we also have another important figure, is Maria Sabina. In 1955, she gave a Westerner coming to her village in Mexico a psilocybin ritual. Now, up until that point, those rituals were all closed to outsiders. And at that point, she started inviting people in. Now, there was many things that happened at this point. Now, there's some really positive things where psilocybin got shared. It actually eventually, 5 years later, ended up in Albert Hofmann's hands, and Albert Hofmann did the first isolation of psilocybin from a mushroom in history because of Maria Sabina. But unfortunately, there was some really negative things that happened, because after Westerners were coming down to her village, there was a lot of disrespect that happened. The Westerners really not taking care for the ritual or the culture or, even just the planet. And so Maria Sabina was actually exiled from her town, and she actually was not rich from what happened. She kind of was bitter towards the end of her life because she had had so much negative problems, being poor, being isolated, and then having, a lot of Westerners treat her very badly because she had given this medicine as a gift to us as Westerners. And I think that her sacrifice should be really honored, because she gave us a really important discovery, and it also speaks to the problem that we have of acculturation, of taking somebody's culture and taking some of their medicine and then not like giving back into that cycle or respecting where that comes from. So then we end up having the second wave of psychedelics really get going. We have the 50s, the 60s, the 70s that we all hear about, with all of the, rock music and the Grateful Dead and things like that. Now, it's really cool because the discovery of LSD eventually leads to the discovery of serotonin, and hence leads to all the depression meds that we now have. We were finally able to understand how a lot of the neurotransmitters work, and that is because of LSD. As we go through history, we all know that Timothy Leary came on the scene. He was a Harvard University professor, and he spent about 2 years really promoting LSD until it kind of got a little too sensational. His scene was a little bit more party and a little less research, and it caused a lot of problems. It caused a lot of rub. And up until that point, there was a lot of research going with these psychedelic medicines, either to help or to understand the brain. And a lot of people are, as far as scientists, were mad at Timothy Leary because he was bringing a different kind of light to psychedelics. Of course, the anti-war movement became part of the psychedelic movement because, as Timothy Leary said, turn on, tune in, turn out. Oh, I think I messed that up. In any case, that kind of led to the parties that be the government, people, the aristocracy, the patriarchy, they all saw these young people taking this drug and not wanting to do what their duty was. They saw them going against cultural norms, and they didn't want to go fight in Vietnam. They didn't want to take on these responsibilities to be shackled by, these jobs and this debt. And so it became a problem that the institution thought that they needed to shut this down. And even during that time where, some of the earlier people were like Tim Scully, they were out there making the LSD and they were giving it away and they were trying to start this revolution. They knew that there would be a point where the government would step in. And that did happen. It became the war on drugs. That was during the early 80s and the Reagan administration. You have this wonderful poster about your brain being on drugs and frying up like an egg. And at that point, psychedelic research wasn't stopped. It wasn't banned. The funding stopped. And so slowly it trickled out. And sadly, things like research with people with alcoholism that was happening, it stopped. People with different types of psychosocial diseases, it all stopped. And we kind of went through like a dark age, and that kind of ends the end of the second wave of the psychedelic revolution. I just wanted to show you this quick chart here. This is a chart showing the research done on psilocybin, and you can see how it really peaks in the 60s, and then we kind of go trickling down through after the 70s, and in the 80s towards the 90s we don't really have any research because there's no funding, there's no way to get the substances. There's a lot of bad propaganda that was started. The idea that people who do psychedelics are legally crazy, making the penalties for having, psychedelics to being treason is a pretty big crime. So people really wanted to stay away from it. And it kind of went through a glut, and it just wasn't around. And the people who knew how to make it were gone as far as like LSD. And the knowledge was kind of suppressed. And then we have the third wave of psychedelics, which really I like to think of starting about the time that MAPS was formed in the late 80s. Now, MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Studies. If you're not familiar with them, they are one to Google as soon as we get off of this call. And they have been, since the 80s, working underground and above ground, trying to get more research started for depression and addiction and PTSD. And they've raised funds and they've looked at making the research be really good. Because back during the first part of the psychedelic revolution, there was a problem where our science wasn't even really good. When you look at any medical studies from the 50s, like, was it really placebo controlled? Was it blinded? Were the participants really taking what they should have been taking? Or was there maybe it was the researchers were putting, too much empathy into the project, things like that. And so really MAPS has done a good job of taking the really rigid science and holding up psychedelics to that. And they're doing a lot of different research. There's cannabis research in Canada that they're supporting. There's the MDMA for PTSD in veterans that's happening. It's phase 3 trials that have just started. If you haven't heard about that, it's very exciting. Maybe that's why you're here on our call today. And then in the UK, they're supporting some research on psilocybin for depression. And I think that part of the cool thing about the third wave of psychedelics is that we're kind of coming back to cultural normality with psychedelics. We have stories that are part of mythologies that are part of our culture, and we have things like Erwids that are, deep resources of case studies of people doing substances and what that means, and showing that people don't just jump out of windows. And then we have a culture of safety where we have organizations like Dance Safe that are coming along and supporting the movement and trying not to demonize people for substance use, whether recreational or therapeutic, and understanding that people are going to want to experiment and that it's normal. It's a normal part of our physiology. We've been experimenting with intoxicants since the beginning of time, since the beginning of man. And that they want us to be as safe as possible. And there's a lot of resources out there. And so that's where we are now, where it's really opening up. And we'll talk more in the future about pharmaceutical companies and what the implications are there. I wanted to touch on these really important topics real quick before we go. Some ethnobotanical issues for psychedelics and plant medicine at large. Acculturation. We talked about Maria Sabina a few minutes ago, and we want to be concerned about where our medicine comes from. We want to make sure that we're not just taking somebody's culture and changing it for our own and expecting them to have nothing or to leave them behind, because these medicines are sacred to many of these people, and we need to think about how that impacts them socially and culturally, as well as how it impacts the planet. There's, peyote is an amazing medicine. However, there's a limited supply of it, and it is hard to find. And if we go out and we just rip up all the peyote that we find, or we have lots of people doing peyote hunting in places that's not theirs, maybe they're on historically Native American lands, then we're taking something from the planet that we might not be able to get back, and we're taking something from a culture that's already really been put through the ringer, and we need to be very cautious about that. And the recommendation is just to not go any farther than you need to. We don't use the hardest drug we have because we can. We want to only go as far into psychedelics as we need to solve our problems, or as many times as we need to solve our problems, instead of using them willy-nilly and just like they're disposable, right? We want to be conscientious users and not consumers. So next, part 2, we're going to go ahead and talk about the future of psychedelics. Toby is going to be leading our session next week, and he's going to be talking about legalization versus decriminalization. He's going to be talking about the different ways that you can access psychedelics, and then he's also going to talk about some quality issues, and he's going to talk about some sociological implications as far as past criminalizations and the communities that are hit by the war on drugs, and where we are now with psychedelics. So I definitely have a biography. If you need more information, please visit us at www.alteredstatesintegration.com/resources. We have many resources there. I recommend Michael Pollan's book. It's very chunky, so if you want to read it, it might actually go better as an audiobook. That's how I'm listening to it. And we're going to go ahead and move on to some questions. So if you want to put your questions in the box below, then we can answer them for you.
Thank you so much, Liza. I learned some cool things. Thank you for sharing. I just want to open it up to questions. I know we're at our 30 minutes right now, but wasn't sure if anyone had some questions. If you got any questions, drop them in the chat. Otherwise, we will see you guys next week. I'll give a couple minutes if anyone has questions. Next week, yeah, like Liza said, we're talking about decriminalization versus legalization. We are going to be meeting next week, 7:30 Central Time, same time as tonight. And then for the rest of the class is just going to be every Tuesday going forward. So our third episode is going to be on the 3rd of December, 7:30 Central Time, and then our final episode that addresses how to prepare for a psychedelic experience is going to be the 10th of December, 7:30 Central Time again. We got a comment from Laura Liza that says, thanks so much for offering this. But I don't see any questions. We'll just wait another minute or two. Otherwise, we'll bid you guys good night. If you haven't followed us on Instagram or Facebook, we have presence on both of those socials. And then we are also on alteredstatesintegration.com. We run a peer support group for integration. We also offer one-on-one coaching as well as pre and post work. So we do what I kind of like to call homework on our website, where we'll do some intention setting, have some activities for you to do pre-experience. And then we also focus on psychedelic aftercare, what to do after the experience to get the maximum benefit out of your altered state experience. I don't see any questions from anyone, so I think that's all we got for this week. Hope to see you guys all back here for next week, part 2, talking about decriminalization versus legalization and the nuances that are from that. Thank you guys so much.